Delta Green, The Children of Gretchen Manor. Part 1. Delta Green is a role-playing game of Lovecraftian horror, conspiracy, and the unnatural. In this world, our group must investigate and stop supernatural entities before they can cause irreparable harm. Delta Green operates from the shadows, an organization dedicated to keeping the unnatural in check, and more importantly, keeping the public ignorant of the horrors lurking just beyond the edge of reality. But the characters we play aren't superheroes. They're soldiers, detectives, doctors, technicians. Ordinary people who, through bad luck or circumstance, have been pulled into a bizarre and dangerous world. And once you've seen the unnatural, it has a habit of seeing you back. The Missing Children. Our story begins in Brooklyn, New York. 3 children have disappeared. There are no witnesses, no suspects, no signs of forced entry. In one case, a mother swore that her child had been safely locked inside a bedroom. The door remained locked when she returned, but the child was gone. No open windows, no hidden exits, nothing. 3 children had simply vanished. The authorities were running out of explanations. That was when Delta Green became involved. 5 operatives were assembled to discover what had taken the children, and if necessary, destroy whatever was responsible. The briefing. We begin at a local fast food burger joint in Queens. The smell of grilled meat, hot oil, and stale coffee hung heavily in the air. Families talked over one another while teenagers crowded around tables, laughing and staring at their phones. Nobody paid much attention to the older man sitting alone in a corner booth. Mr. Blake, one of the agency's handlers, calmly ate his meal while several folders lay scattered across the table before him. 5 files, 5 operatives. The first belonged to John, a detective and veteran of several Delta Green operations. He had survived encounters that would have broken lesser men, though each mission had left another invisible scar. His partner Paul was a military man, disciplined, physically imposing, always ready for a fight. Then there was Everett, the team's technical specialist. Give her a computer and enough time, and she could uncover information that governments and corporations had spent fortunes trying to bury. Unfortunately, Everett had seen too much. Her repeated exposure to the unnatural had done something to her mind, perhaps even to her body. The unnatural had a way of latching onto people, and Blake suspected that something had already attached itself to Everett. The remaining 2 operatives were consultants rather than official agents. Marisol worked at one of Brooklyn's oldest medical institutions. She had little field experience but possessed extensive medical knowledge, something Delta Green had learned never to underestimate. The final file was unusual. Felix Domingo, an ex-convict from the Philippines, a fraud, a scam artist, and, according to several highly classified reports, an actual mangkukulam. Felix possessed genuine unnatural abilities. Unfortunately, he had once used those gifts to manipulate people and separate desperate clients from their money. Eventually, his schemes caught up with him. Prison followed. After his release, Delta Green found him. Now Felix served the agency as an occult specialist, working off the many crimes that still hung over his head. Blake stared at Felix's photograph. Even on paper, the man looked like trouble. The restaurant door opened. Paul entered, still dressed in his field uniform. From the look of him, he had probably come directly from another assignment. He scanned the restaurant before spotting Blake in the corner. Marisol was already sitting across from the handler. "Sorry," Paul said as he approached. "I had to drop John off at his house. He won't be joining us tonight. Needs some personal time with the wife before the next mission." Paul pulled out a chair. "I'll catch him up." Blake waved him toward the seat. "No problem, my boy," the handler replied in his heavy southern accent. "Sit yourself down. Got some food ready for y'all." He gestured toward Marisol. "Oh, and this here is Marisol, doctor and agency consultant. Whenever we have need of her particular talents, we give her a call. Marisol looked up at the soldier and offered her hand. A pleasure, Agent Paul. Paul shook it politely. Then the restaurant door opened again. A greasy-looking Filipino man wandered inside. Numerous bracelets, bangles, charms, and necklaces covered his arms and neck. They jingled with every uneven step he took. His clothes smelled faintly of smoke, herbs, and something Paul immediately suspected was marijuana. Felix stumbled toward the table. Blake closed his eyes and sighed. And this, my friends, is Felix. Felix grinned, revealing several badly stained teeth. Ex-con in service to the agency, Blake continued, specializes in the occult, fortune teller, medicine man, witch doctor. I don't rightly know what he called himself back in the Philippines. Mangkukulam, Felix corrected. Right, that. Felix immediately reached across the table, grabbed a handful of Paul's fries and began stuffing them into his mouth. Blake continued. His scams eventually got him locked up. When he got out, we found him. Turns out his so-called gifts are the genuine article. Paul stared at Felix. Felix slowly stopped chewing. The two men looked at one another. Is this all the agency could scrape together for this mission? Paul muttered. Felix's smile disappeared. Without warning, the old Filipino lunged across the table and grabbed Paul's head. Paul's eyes rolled back. One of the strange symbols carved into Felix's bangles began to glow. Felix whispered in Tagalog, Ipakita ko ang dilim na tinago mo. Let me show you the darkness you have hidden. The restaurant disappeared. For a moment, Felix and Paul saw the same fragmented images. A previous mission. Blood. Screaming. An ancient creature resembling something dragged from an Aztec nightmare. Paul fighting alongside another team of agents. Paul wounded. And something watching him from the darkness. Then the vision ended. Felix released him. Paul gasped and nearly fell from his chair. Felix leaned closer. Your monsters have not disappeared, he whispered. Not yet. Blake slammed his hand against the table. Felix. Several customers glanced toward them. Blake lowered his voice. You will step down, and you will never do that in public again. Felix shrugged. Then he grabbed another handful of fries. Paul stared at him with murder in his eyes. Not long afterward, Everett arrived. She greeted the others, immediately recognizing Paul from their previous mission. Then she saw Felix. She stopped. A whisper crawled through her mind. It wasn't Felix's voice. At least, she didn't think it was. You have the stench of the unknown. Everett's smile faded. It will not heal. Felix looked directly at her. You are like me. John's decision. Meanwhile, somewhere in New York, John quietly returned home. It was late. The apartment was dark except for the faint orange glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. His wife was already asleep. John removed his jacket and placed his service weapon on the table. For several moments, he simply stood there. Another mission. Another missing person case. Another classified file filled with blacked-out paragraphs and photographs he would never be able to forget. He walked into the bathroom and switched on the light. Something rested beside the sink. A pregnancy test. John froze. 2 lines. Positive. He picked it up carefully. For the first time in years, the hardened detective felt completely unprepared. He looked toward the bedroom. His wife slept peacefully, unaware that he had already returned. John sat on the edge of the bathtub. Delta Green had taken years from him. Friends. Sleep. Pieces of his sanity. Every mission came with the possibility that he simply wouldn't come home. But now, someone else would be waiting for him. John stared at the pregnancy test. One more mission. That was all. After this case, he would leave the agency. He would take care of his family. And he would never again walk willingly into the darkness. At least, that was what he told himself. Gretchen Manor. Paul contacted John and told him where to meet them. The following morning, Paul collected the team in his van. John climbed inside. Felix immediately stared at him. The Mangkukulam sniffed the air. Once. Twice. "You smell of death," Felix said. John frowned. Felix grinned. "But congratulations on the child." The van became silent. John stared at him. "Excuse me?" Felix simply smiled and looked out the window. John said nothing. He had told nobody about the pregnancy. Not even his wife knew that he had discovered the test. For the remainder of the drive, John avoided looking at Felix. He also kept his decision to retire to himself. Eventually they arrived at Gretchen Manor. The enormous building stood behind temporary fencing and construction equipment. Scaffolding covered parts of its aging exterior. The manor was being renovated. Marisol had remained at the medical center to examine records concerning the 3 missing children and their families. Paul and Everett approached the construction foreman. John and Felix decided to inspect the manor's exterior. According to the foreman, a company known as the Zenon Group currently controlled the property. "They're turning it into some kind of sleep and dine establishment," the foreman explained. "Hotel, restaurant, fancy place. Owners want to keep the old manor aesthetic." Paul glanced toward the building. "What do you know about its history?" The foreman's expression changed. "Depends if you believe rumors." "We're listening." The man lowered his voice. "Back in the 60s, people thought the husband had something to do with those missing children. Never proved it." He pointed toward the surrounding neighborhood. "Used to be more buildings around here. Whole estate, apparently. Most of them are gone now." "And the owners?" "The wife came from the Gretchen family. She inherited the deed. After everything happened, they removed the husband's name from the property records." The foreman paused. "He's buried nearby. Private crypt in the old graveyard." Everett made a note. "How long have renovations been underway?" 2 years. "Any problems?" The foreman laughed nervously. "Construction always has problems." Everett didn't laugh. The foreman sighed. "Some of the workers say they hear things." "What kind of things?" "Voices. Footsteps. Sometimes they see someone walking through the house." "Anyone specific?" "No." The foreman glanced at the manor. "They just know they're not supposed to be there." Meanwhile, John and Felix walked along the mansion's perimeter. John kept several steps between himself and the Mangkukulam. He didn't trust Felix. The man was a convicted criminal. He smelled of weed and stale smoke. And somehow he knew about John's unborn child. Felix suddenly stopped. He slowly approached the manor. Then he placed one hand against the wall. Felix violently pulled away. He stumbled backward as if the building had burned him. His face had gone pale. Sweat rolled down his forehead. "In this house," Felix whispered. John reached for his weapon. Felix stared at the manor. "Evil resides." His hands were shaking. Felix quickly lit something and took a long puff, desperately trying to calm himself. For once, John didn't comment on the smell. Following the trail, the team reconvened inside Paul's van. After sharing what they had discovered, they decided to divide their resources. Paul would investigate the history and property records of Gretchen Manor. John would contact the local police department and obtain information concerning the recent disappearances. Everett would search historical archives with Marisol, focusing on the deaths that occurred during the 1960s. Felix would remain near the manor and question people in the neighborhood. Hours passed. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle emerged. Paul discovered old architectural plans of the estate. Gretchen Manor had changed ownership several times over the decades. At one point, it had been converted into a school. Later, it became a halfway house for people with mental disabilities. 5 years ago, the Xenon Group acquired the property. Renovations began 2 years later. John's police contacts provided details concerning the missing children: names, ages, parents. But no suspects. Security cameras had captured nothing. One mother claimed her child had vanished from a locked bedroom. Several crime scenes contained unusual claw marks. The police initially assumed they had been left by raccoons or another urban animal. Old bones were discovered near one scene, but investigators had been unable to identify them. The clothing of one missing child was later recovered near the pier. Torn, waterlogged, empty. Everett and Marisol made another disturbing discovery. Several historical disappearances appeared to follow the city's underground sewer system. If their theory was correct, the entity, or entities, responsible for the abductions were using the sewers to travel beneath Brooklyn. The implications were terrifying. The sewer network was enormous. Whatever was taking the children could emerge almost anywhere. Felix, meanwhile, found a young homeless Latino boy named Carlos. The boy initially refused to speak. Felix offered him food. Eventually, Carlos talked. "Sometimes I sleep near the old house," the boy said. Felix nodded. "You see anything?" Carlos looked toward Gretchen Manor. "I heard my family." Felix became still. "Your family?" "My mother, my brothers." "They were inside?" Carlos shook his head. "My family's gone." Felix watched the boy carefully. "They were calling me," Carlos whispered, "telling me to come inside." "What did you do?" Carlos looked at him. "I ran." The fear in the boy's eyes told Felix everything he needed to know.
Due to subscription issues, I will take over as voice for the final part of this tale. The Crypt. The team gathered once again to share their discoveries. Felix listened quietly. Then he made a suggestion. "We visit Sumayed." John frowned. "He's dead." Felix smiled. Dead men remember many things. Nobody liked the idea. Unfortunately, nobody had a better one too. They prepared shovels, crowbars, flashlights, and several other pieces of equipment before waiting for nightfall. Then they drove to the graveyard. Unfortunately, a member of the cemetery staff was still working near the entrance. John stepped forward. He displayed his badge. "We need access to the crypt. Official investigation." The staff member looked suspicious. "At this hour?" Time sensitive. After several uncomfortable seconds, she agreed. She produced an old map and pointed towards the location of Mr. Sumayed's crypt. Then she hesitated. "You know, there was an incident there." John looked up. "When?" "About 2 years ago." "What happened?" "Some hooligans broke into the crypt." "Vandalism?" The woman shook her head. "They stole the bones." The agents exchanged glances. 2 years ago. The same year renovations began at Gretchen Manor. They found the crypt shortly afterward. The air around it felt colder. Felix entered first. He placed his bag on the ground and began preparing a ritual. Herbs, incense, black candles. He drew strange symbols across the stone floor. John watched him. "You sure you know what you're doing?" "No." John stared at him. Felix grinned. Then the Mankukulam closed his eyes. Smoke filled the crypt. He began to chant. Matay pumikit, diway dumilat, tabing ng lihim, ngayoy mawaglit, sa usok at anino, landas ay buksan. Ipakita sa akin ang di namamasdan. Felix's body stiffened. His eyes turned white. Then he began to convulse. Felix opened his eyes, but he was no longer standing inside the crypt. He was lying down, trapped, unable to move. He realized with horror that he was seeing through the eyes of the corpse that had once rested inside the coffin. The crypt lid slowly opened. Creatures stared down at him. Humanoid, thin. Dark fur covered their twisted bodies. Their eyes reflected the darkness like those of nocturnal animals. Long claws scraped against stone. The creatures reached inside. They pulled the bones from the coffin one by one. Then one of them lifted the skull. It stared directly at Felix, not the corpse, Felix himself. The creature knew he was watching. Its mouth opened, and it spoke in Tagalog. Halika sa mansyon. Come to the mansion. The creature smiled. Tatanggapin ka namin. We will welcome you. The vision ended. Felix screamed. His mind snapped. He kicked over the candles and ran from the crypt. Felix! Marisol shouted. But the mangkukulam couldn't hear her. The people around him were no longer his allies. They were shapes, shadows, monsters wearing familiar faces. Felix ran toward the car. Everett pulled out her taser. Stop! Felix ignored her. She fired. Felix twisted aside and somehow escaped the wires. Paul reacted immediately. The soldier charged. He tackled Felix to the ground. Felix screamed and clawed at him. Get off me! Hold him! John rushed forward. He drew his baton. Sorry, Felix. Crack! The baton struck Felix across the head. The mangkukulam groaned. Marisol prepared a tranquilizer. Keep him still. Paul pinned Felix's arms. Marisol carefully measured the dose and injected him. Slowly, Felix stopped fighting. His eyes closed. Silence returned to the graveyard. The team stood there, exhausted. Paul caught his breath. John stared at the unconscious mangkukulam. Everett looked back toward the crypt. Something had terrified Felix. Not frightened him, not surprised him, terrified him. They handcuffed Felix and placed him inside the van. For several moments, nobody spoke. One question lingered in everyone's mind. What did Felix see inside that crypt? And perhaps the more important question, what was waiting for them at Gretchen Manor? And this is part 1 of our Delta Green session. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you'd like to hear what happens next at Gretchen Manor, please subscribe, leave a like, and join us for part 2. Because the team has finally found a trail. Unfortunately, something in the darkness already knows they're coming.